The morning of April 7th, 1945, brought clear skies over the Ruhr Valley. Hauptmann Werner Schröder stood beside his Panther Ausf G, watching his tank company form up along the tree line east of Iserlohn. 23 tanks waited in the column, a mixture of Panthers and Mark IVs, representing one of the last effective armoured formations in Army Group B. They had been ordered to move northwest toward Dortmund, attempting to relieve encircled units trapped in the shrinking Ruhr pocket. Schröder had commanded tanks since 1941. He had fought in Russia, survived Kursk, and understood the mathematics of armoured warfare in 1945. His Panthers could defeat any Allied tank in direct combat. The 75mm gun mounted on his vehicle could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armour at ranges exceeding a mile. The sloped glacis plate on his tank could resist American tank fire at all but point-blank range. In a fair fight, tank against tank, across open ground, the technical advantage belonged to Germany. But the war had long ago stopped being fair. American fighter bombers owned the daylight sky. Schröder had learned to move only in poor weather, in early morning or late evening, using whatever cover the terrain provided. His crews knew the sound of every Allied aircraft engine. They could distinguish a Thunderbolt from a Mustang by sound alone, could recognize the whistle of rockets, the distinctive roar of a diving attack. They had developed techniques for survival, dispersing when aircraft appeared, using smoke, seeking cover under bridges and in tree lines. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What concerned Schröder that morning was not the familiar threat of bombs or rockets. His intelligence officer had shown him a captured Allied document the previous evening, a tactical manual describing new weapons being employed by American fighter bombers. The document mentioned 30mm autocannons, guns capable of penetrating armour from above. Schröder had dismissed it initially. Aircraft cannon were nothing new. His tanks had weathered strafing attacks before. Machine gun bullets bounced off armour plate. Even the heavy half-inch caliber weapons the Americans used extensively lacked the power to threaten a tank seriously. But the report included specifics that troubled him. The 30mm round weighed 12 ounces, 4 times heavier than a 50 caliber bullet. The muzzle velocity exceeded 2,700 feet per second. Most significantly, the document stated the weapon could penetrate 2 inches of steel plate at close range. Schröder performed the calculation in his head. 2 inches was roughly 50mm. His Panther's roof armour measured 16mm, barely 5/8 of an inch. If the document was accurate, if these weapons were being employed in his sector, his tanks were vulnerable from above in ways they had never been before. He shared these concerns with his company commanders during the pre-movement briefing. Most were skeptical. Oberleutnant Hartmann, commanding the 2nd Platoon, pointed out that aircraft had been attacking tanks for years with limited success. Hauptmann Berger, commanding the Mark IV Platoon, noted that their roof armour had protected them adequately against all previous air attacks. Why should this be different? Schröder could not answer convincingly. He had no direct evidence, only a captured document, and an uncomfortable feeling that something had changed in the tactical equation. At 06:30 hours, the column began moving. Tanks spaced themselves at 50-metre intervals, maintaining formation as they navigated the secondary road leading northwest. The morning remained clear, visibility unlimited, conditions that made Schröder profoundly uneasy. He would have preferred rain, fog, anything that would ground Allied aircraft or at least reduce their effectiveness. But the weather offered no assistance. The column moved through open farmland, exposed, visible from the air for miles. Part 2. Building the World. The armour doctrine German tank development in World War II reflected a clear doctrinal evolution shaped by combat experience and industrial constraints. The Panther, introduced in 1943 following the shock of encountering Soviet 34 tanks at the front, represented Germany's attempt to produce a medium tank that could dominate the battlefield through superior firepower and protection. The design philosophy emphasized frontal armor and gun performance above all other considerations. The armor scheme on a Panther Ausf G demonstrated this priority clearly. The glacis plate, the sloped frontal armor, measured 80 mm thick, set at 55 degrees from vertical. This angle increased the effective thickness dramatically. A projectile striking this plate had to penetrate not 80 mm but closer to 140 mm when accounting for the slope. American 75 mm guns, the primary armament on Sherman tanks through most of the war, could not penetrate this armor at typical combat ranges. Even the improved 76 mm gun introduced on later Sherman variants struggled against the Panther's frontal protection. The turret armor continued this emphasis. The mantlet, the armored shield around the gun, reached 100 mm in thickness in places. The turret front measured 110 mm. The turret sides were 45 mm, thinner than the front but still substantial. This armor could resist most Allied anti-tank weapons when engaged frontally or at angles favorable to the defender. German crews were trained to present these aspects to the enemy, to fight from hull-down positions where possible, to use terrain and positioning to maximize their armor advantage. The sides and rear received less protection because designers assumed these aspects would be presented to the enemy less frequently and at greater ranges. Side armor on the hull measured 40 mm on the upper portion, tapering to 40 mm on the lower hull as well. Rear armor measured 40 mm on the turret and the hull. This was adequate against most threats encountered in typical combat. Anti-tank guns attempting flanking shots at long range would struggle to penetrate even this thinner armor. The roof armor, however, told a different story. The engine deck measured 16 mm. The turret roof measured 16 mm. The hull roof over the crew compartment measured 16 mm as well. This was the thinnest armor on the entire vehicle, roughly 5/8 of an inch of steel plate. German designers considered this adequate for the threats anticipated from above. Artillery posed a significant danger to tanks, but primarily through near misses rather than direct hits. Artillery shells exploding above or beside a tank created fragmentation and blast effects. The fragments were irregular pieces of shell casing, traveling at high velocity but lacking the mass and design to penetrate significant armor. 16 mm of steel would stop most artillery fragments at typical burst distances. Direct hits from artillery were rare and usually catastrophic, regardless of armor thickness. Aircraft presented a different threat profile in the early war years. Bombers carried high-explosive bombs that required direct hits or very close proximity to destroy a tank. The accuracy achievable from bombing altitude made direct hits unlikely. Fighter aircraft carried machine guns, typically rifle-caliber or heavy machine guns in the half-inch range. These weapons could damage external equipment, kill exposed crew members, and suppress anti-aircraft defenses. But they could not penetrate the roof armor of a tank at the shallow angles typical of strafing runs. The few specialized anti-tank aircraft that existed before 1944 generally mounted cannons in the 20 mm to 40 mm range. The British Hurricane IID, fitted with two 40 mm Vickers S guns, proved the concept of tank busting from the air during North African campaigns in 1942 and 1943. These aircraft achieved kills against German armor, but they were relatively rare, vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, and required skilled pilots to employ effectively. German tankers respected them but did not consider them the primary threat. The Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik represented a more serious challenge. This purpose-built ground attack aircraft carried armor protection for the crew and engine, making it remarkably resilient to ground fire. Various armament configurations included 23 mm cannons, 37 mm cannons, and later models with rockets and bombs. Soviet pilots developed effective tactics for attacking German armor, often approaching at low altitude and firing into the thinner top and rear armor. German forces on the Eastern Front learned to fear the Sturmovik, but even there, the primary killers of tanks remained other tanks and anti-tank guns rather than aircraft. Part 3. The American Air Weapon. The United States entered World War II with tactical air doctrine that emphasized strategic bombing and air superiority over close air support. This reflected both doctrinal preference and the practical reality that America's potential enemies in 1941, Germany and Japan, were across oceans. American planners envisioned long-range bombers striking enemy industrial centers and fighter aircraft sweeping enemy planes from the sky. Close coordination with ground forces received less emphasis in pre-war planning. Combat experience in North Africa and Italy forced rapid evolution of these doctrines. American ground commanders quickly recognized the value of air support in reducing enemy strong points, interdicting supply lines, and attacking armor. The Army Air Forces adapted existing aircraft for ground attack roles and developed procedures for coordinating airstrikes with ground operations. By 1944, American close air support had become increasingly effective, employing a variety of weapons and techniques. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt emerged as one of the most effective fighter bombers of the war. Originally designed as a high-altitude escort fighter, the Thunderbolt proved remarkably adaptable to ground attack missions. The aircraft was large and robust, capable of absorbing significant battle damage and continuing to fly. It could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs on external racks or 10 5-inch rockets, or a combination of both. The internal armament consisted of 8 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, with approximately 400 rounds per gun. This armament proved effective against a wide range of targets. Bombs could destroy bridges, buildings, and rail yards. Rockets, while less accurate than bombs, could saturate areas and achieve kills through volume of fire. The 50-caliber machine guns were devastating against soft targets. Trucks, half-tracks, railroad cars, and troop concentrations could be destroyed or suppressed effectively by strafing attacks. Against lightly armored vehicles, the armor-piercing variant of 50-caliber ammunition could penetrate and disable. But against heavy tanks like the Panther, these weapons showed limitations. Bombs required direct hits or very near misses to guarantee kills, a level of accuracy difficult to achieve consistently against moving or dispersed targets. Pilots typically attacked from altitudes of several thousand feet, releasing bombs in dives and pulling out well above. Small arms range, the circular error probable, the radius within which half the bombs would land, measured in dozens of yards, even with skilled pilots. A tank presented a target roughly 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. The odds of achieving a direct hit on a specific tank were poor unless the aircraft made multiple passes, exposing itself to anti-aircraft fire. Rockets offered better accuracy at closer ranges, but still required significant skill to employ effectively against point targets. The 5-inch HVAR carried an 11-pound warhead and could penetrate roughly 3 inches of armor with a direct hit. The problem was achieving that direct hit. Rockets were unguided, ballistic weapons subject to wind, aircraft motion, and minor variations in motor performance. Pilots learned to fire salvos, launching multiple rockets in quick succession to increase hit probability. Against dispersed armor, this meant each tank might receive only 1 or 2 rockets in an attack run, with no guarantee of hits. The 50-caliber machine guns, while excellent against many targets, lacked the penetrating power to defeat heavy tank armor reliably. The armor-piercing M2 round could penetrate approximately 23 millimeters of face-hardened steel at 200 meters when striking perpendicular to the plate. But aircraft guns fired at shallow angles during strafing runs, typically between 10 and 30 degrees from horizontal. At these angles, the effective armor thickness increased dramatically due to the oblique impact. The bullets would ricochet or shatter against the tank's sloped surfaces without penetrating. American ordnance officers and tactical planners understood these limitations by late 1944. Various solutions were explored. Napalm proved effective when it could be delivered accurately, burning externally mounted equipment and potentially forcing crews to abandon vehicles. Specialized anti-tank bombs were developed, including cluster munitions designed to attack tanks from above, but the most promising development involved heavier cannons. The 30mm M4 autocannon had been developed initially for bomber defensive armament. The weapon fired a substantially larger and heavier projectile than the 50 caliber machine gun, with better armor penetration characteristics. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground demonstrated that the armor-piercing variant of 30mm ammunition could penetrate 50mm of face-hardened steel armor at ranges under 500 yards when striking perpendicular to the plate. This penetration capability opened new tactical possibilities against German armor, whose roof armor measured between 16 and 25mm on most vehicles. Retry, CK Generate, Part 7, 8, 9, that focusing, The Cost of Truth, Aftermath and Legacy, Section 5, Aftermath and Legacy Goal. Conclude the story, detailing the immediate and long-term consequences. Content. Explain what happened to the person, unit, technology after the event. Analyze the significance of this small story within the larger World War II context. End with a reflective conclusion that ties back powerfully to the initial hook and thesis. Generate each part with 600 words. At the end of script, add this final CTA. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Part 7. The reckoning Hauptmann Werner Schröder survived the attack on April 7, 1945. His Panther, positioned near the rear of the column when the American aircraft struck, sustained damage to the engine deck but remained mobile. He ordered his driver to reverse into a tree line, using smoke grenades to obscure their movement. From this position, he watched the systematic destruction of his company. 16 tanks burned in the space of 20 minutes. The remainder scattered, seeking whatever cover the terrain provided, abandoning the mission entirely. Schröder filed his after-action report 3 days later at a temporary headquarters established in a farmhouse south of Hagen. His report documented the attack in clinical detail: aircraft type, weapons employed, tactics observed, damage assessment. He noted specifically that the 30mm cannon rounds had penetrated roof armor on multiple vehicles, killing or wounding crew members and igniting ammunition and fuel. He recommended immediate dispersal protocols for any movement during daylight hours, maximum spacing between vehicles, and abandonment of road marches in favor of cross-country movement using maximum available cover. The report traveled up the chain of command to Army Group B headquarters, where it joined dozens of similar reports arriving daily from units across the shrinking pocket. Staff officers compiled the information, noting the pattern. American fighter bombers had shifted tactics and weaponry. The 30mm cannon was appearing with increasing frequency. German armor, designed to dominate ground combat, was being systematically destroyed from above by weapons that exploited the single weakest aspect of the tank's protection. No practical countermeasures existed. Additional roof armor would require redesigning vehicles that were already overstressed mechanically. The Panther's final drive units failed frequently under the current 45-ton weight. Adding armor would accelerate these failures and reduce already limited mobility. Schröder's company, what remained of it, continued operating for another 10 days. They fought from static positions, using their tanks as armored bunkers rather than mobile weapons. When ammunition ran low and fuel became unavailable, crews destroyed their own vehicles and retreated west on foot. Schröder surrendered to American forces on April 18 near Remscheid. He spent the next 3 years in a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana, working on a farm, processing the implications of what he had experienced. The broader pattern Schröder witnessed played out across Germany in the final months of the war. German armoured forces, once the cutting edge of mechanized warfare, found themselves increasingly unable to operate effectively during daylight hours. Allied air superiority was total by spring 1945. American, British, and Canadian fighter bombers roamed at will, attacking anything that moved. The introduction of heavier cannons gave these aircraft the ability to kill tanks directly, rather than relying on the less reliable methods of bombs and rockets. Statistics compiled after the war revealed the extent of this aerial dominance. In the final 3 months of fighting in Western Europe, from February through April 1945, German armoured units reported higher losses to air attack than to ground combat. Exact figures remain disputed due to incomplete records and the chaos of Germany's collapse, but credible estimates suggest that between 30 and 40% of German armour destroyed in this period fell to aircraft rather than to other tanks or anti-tank guns. This represented a fundamental shift in armoured warfare. Tanks had been designed primarily to fight other tanks and to support infantry against ground-based threats. The concept of vulnerability from above had been acknowledged but considered secondary. Artillery remained the primary overhead threat, and 16 millimeters of roof armour sufficed against artillery fragmentation. Aircraft had been dangerous, but not decisively so through most of the war. The combination of total air superiority and weapons capable of exploiting thin roof armour changed this calculation completely. German engineers recognized the problem but lacked time and resources to address it. Proposals for vehicles with increased roof armour existed on drawing boards. Experimental installations of additional armour plates were tested on a handful of vehicles. But Germany's industrial capacity in 1945 was collapsing under sustained Allied bombing and loss of territory. Factories that remained operational focused on producing existing designs in whatever quantities possible rather than developing new variants. The theoretical solution existed. The practical means to implement it did not. Part 8. The Doctrine Transformed. The American military absorbed the lessons of 30mm cannon employment rapidly and thoroughly. After-action reports from Europe in spring 1945 documented the weapon's effectiveness against German armour. Tactical air commanders noted that aircraft equipped with these cannons achieved higher kill rates per sortie against armoured targets compared to aircraft employing conventional bombs and rockets. The weapon's relatively flat trajectory and high rate of fire made it easier to employ accurately than rockets, while the penetrating power exceeded anything achievable with 50-caliber machine guns. The Army Air Forces expanded 30mm cannon deployment in the final weeks of the European War. Production of gun pods accelerated. More P-47 squadrons received the weapons. Training emphasized diving attacks from optimal angles to maximize penetration probability. Pilots learned to recognize different German tank types from above, to distinguish between heavy tanks requiring multiple hits and lighter vehicles vulnerable to single strikes. Gun camera footage from successful attacks was analyzed and used to refine tactics. The effectiveness proved sufficient that planning began immediately for expanded use in the Pacific theater. Japan's tank forces were considered even more vulnerable than German armour, with thinner protection and less sophisticated designs. The 30mm cannon would be devastatingly effective against Japanese tanks, which typically had roof armour measuring between 6 and 12 millimeters. But Japan's surrender in August 1945 came before these plans could be implemented at scale. The war ended with the question of Pacific application unanswered, though the answer would have been predictable given the armour thickness involved. Post-war analysis by American military historians and weapons evaluators examined the 30mm cannon's impact on the European campaign. Reports concluded that the weapon had contributed significantly to Allied success in the final months, particularly in disrupting German armour movements and reducing the effectiveness of counterattacks. The ability to kill tanks from the air with direct-fire weapons rather than relying solely on bombs altered the tactical equation. German commanders had to assume that any daylight movement would result in losses, which constrained their operational flexibility severely. The Soviet Union, which had employed similar weapons throughout the war with their Sturmovik aircraft, noted American success with interest. Soviet 37mm cannons had proven effective against German armour on the Eastern Front, particularly when employed in diving attacks against roof armour. The American adoption of comparable weapons validated Soviet tactical doctrine and encouraged further development of specialized ground attack aircraft with heavy cannon armament in the early Cold War period. British forces, which had experimented with various anti-tank aircraft weapons, including the 40mm Vickers S gun and rockets, studied American employment of 30mm cannons closely. Post-war Royal Air Force doctrine incorporated lessons learned, emphasizing the value of direct-fire weapons against armor. British aircraft development in the late 1940s included consideration of heavy cannon armament for ground attack roles, though the jet age and changing tactical requirements soon shifted priorities toward other weapons systems. The fundamental lesson transcended specific weapons or tactics. It concerned vulnerability and assumption. German tank designers had created vehicles optimized for ground combat, with armor schemes that reflected the threats they expected to face in that environment. These designs proved extraordinarily effective in tank versus tank combat and against most ground-based anti-tank weapons. The Panther could dominate any Allied tank in a fair engagement at typical combat ranges. But modern warfare had evolved beyond fair engagements between comparable forces on level ground. The integration of air power with ground operations meant that tanks now fought in a three-dimensional battlespace. Threats could come from any direction, including directly above. Armor that was impervious frontally could be paper-thin when viewed from overhead. This reality forced a complete reconsideration of tank design principles in the post-war period. Roof armor thickness increased on subsequent tank generations. Protection against overhead attacks became a primary design consideration rather than a secondary concern. The lessons written in burning Panthers along German roads in April 1945 influenced tank design for decades afterward. American doctrine evolved to emphasize air-ground coordination as essential rather than supplementary. The success of fighter bombers against German armor in the war's final months demonstrated that properly equipped and employed air power could be decisive against even the heaviest ground forces. This understanding shaped American military planning through the Cold War, with close air support remaining a central element of combined arms doctrine. The aircraft changed, jets replacing propeller-driven fighters, but the fundamental principle endured. Control of the air meant the ability to attack ground forces with impunity, and modern weapons could exploit vulnerabilities that ground-based defenses could not protect against. Part 9. The Legacy of Vulnerability. 48. He found a country devastated, divided, struggling to rebuild from rubble. He settled in Hamburg, working initially in construction and later as a mechanic in a commercial truck depot. He did not speak much about the war for many years. When he finally did, in interviews conducted in the 1970s for a historical project documenting German armoured forces, his memories focused not on victories or defeats, but on the psychological experience of vulnerability. He described the feeling of standing in a Panther's turret, knowing that the armour protecting him frontally could stop anything the enemy possessed, while simultaneously knowing that aircraft above could kill him with weapons he could neither see coming nor defend against effectively. The tank that made him nearly invincible in ground combat became a trap when aircraft appeared. The protection he trusted became irrelevant when the threat came from the one direction the designers had not prioritized. This psychological dimension of the 30mm cannon's effectiveness often appeared in post-war accounts from German tankers. The weapon's impact was not solely material, measured in destroyed vehicles and casualties. It was also psychological, measured in hesitation, in altered tactics, in the constant fear that accompanied daylight operations. German tank crews in April 1945 had to operate, knowing their vehicles offered minimal protection against a threat that could appear at any moment. This knowledge affected decision-making, morale, and combat effectiveness in ways that statistics could not fully capture. The American pilots who employed these weapons experienced different psychological effects. Many reported that tank-killing missions were among the most satisfying combat operations they flew. Unlike strategic bombing, where results were often difficult to observe directly, or air-to-air combat, which was relatively rare by late 1945, attacks on armor produced immediate, visible results. Pilots could see their cannon strikes hitting targets, could observe secondary explosions and fires, could count destroyed vehicles. The feedback was direct and unmistakable. The weapons worked as advertised. The training proved effective. The mission succeeded. Gun camera footage from these missions, preserved in archives, shows the attacks from the pilot's perspective. The film captures the diving approach, the tank growing larger in the gun sight, the flash of cannon fire, the strikes walking across the target, the smoke and flame that marked a kill. Watching this footage decades later provides visceral understanding of what made these weapons effective. The combination of adequate penetration, acceptable accuracy, and sufficient rate of fire meant that a skilled pilot making a proper attack had excellent probability of destroying or disabling the target. The technical lessons influenced aircraft and weapons development well beyond World War II. The concept of specialized anti-tank aircraft evolved directly from wartime experience with cannons like the 30mm M4. The most famous descendant of this lineage was the Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, introduced in the 1970s. This aircraft mounted a 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a 7-barrel rotary gun capable of firing nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The weapon was designed specifically to destroy Soviet tanks by attacking their thin top armor, exactly the same vulnerability that American pilots had exploited against German Panthers 3 decades earlier. The A-10 represented the ultimate expression of lessons learned in April 1945. Every aspect of the aircraft's design prioritized the anti-armor mission. The cannon was the centerpiece, with the aircraft essentially built around the gun. Armor protection for the pilot and critical systems acknowledged that anti-aircraft fire was inevitable when attacking ground targets. Redundant systems ensured survivability. Low-speed handling characteristics allowed the aircraft to loiter over battlefields and make precise attacks. The design was conservative, even archaic by modern standards, but optimized for a specific mission: killing tanks from above with direct-fire weapons. The story that began with Hauptmann Schröder watching his column destroyed on an April morning in 1945, thus extended through decades of military aviation history. The specific weapon changed. The aircraft evolved from propeller-driven fighters to jet-powered attack planes. The tactics were refined and the technology improved. But the fundamental principle remained constant. Tanks are vulnerable from above. Weapons with adequate penetration and accuracy can exploit this vulnerability. Air superiority enables repeated attacks that ground-based defenses cannot prevent. The lesson was written in burning Panthers in the Ruhr Valley, confirmed in countless engagements since, and remains valid in contemporary warfare. For the men who fought in those final months of World War II, on both sides, the experience offered different meanings. German tankers like Schröder learned that technological superiority in one dimension, frontal armor protection, meant nothing when the enemy could attack from another dimension entirely. American pilots learned that proper weapons and tactics could overcome even the most formidable ground forces. Both sides learned that modern war was three-dimensional, that control of multiple domains was essential, and that assumptions about invulnerability were dangerous, regardless of how much armor plates surrounded you. The morning of April 7, 1945, when American fighter bombers struck that German tank column with 30mm cannons, marked a moment when theory became practice, when potential vulnerability became actual destruction, and when the last illusions about armor invincibility died in the practical demonstration of physics, applied through aerial gunnery. The tanks that German crews trusted, that had protected them through countless engagements, proved helpless against weapons they had not expected to face, fired from angles their armor had not been designed to resist. The result was not just tactical defeat, but conceptual revolution, a fundamental reshaping of how military forces understood the relationship between armor, protection, and vulnerability in modern mechanized warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.